I'm Jeff Gettin with American Purpose. We have a very good hour ahead of us. We've kept the numbers in check so that this can be participant intensive. We'll have a discussion with our moderator and I guess first half and then the balance to you all, questions, comments from the gallery. Bill, Kristol, and Eric and Ray, welcome. No one needs introductions, but Bill, you're going to lead this. Thank you for doing it. And I'll let you kick off the program and introduce our guests.
Thanks, Jeff, and thank you all for coming, and thank you, Eric and Ray, for doing this. Eric and Ray need no introduction to this group, I suspect, but I'll just say they're both rare combinations of genuine scholars and people who participated in government at high level and in the sort of think tank advising government world. So great range of experience, and both contributed to the Weekly Standard back in the day. Both have been subjects, is that the right word, or the objects of conversations with Bill Kristol. So what higher credentials could one have than that? And more importantly for this purpose, Eric and Ray wrote a very good piece in spring, I guess, was it, of 2020 in Foreign Affairs on why regime change in Iran was both, I guess, possible and desirable and the right kind of strategy. You can explain, correct that if you want when we begin talking. And then an update just earlier this week, which I think everyone has seen, and Michelle maybe could put in the chat if that's useful for people, about now that that piece stands up very well, and the update sort of reflecting a little bit on what with the U.S. and others could do. I thought I'd ask them, we'll have a 25-minute or so conversation here and focus on a couple of things, I guess, really what's going on in Iran that I think could be fairly brief, since I suspect a lot of people on this call know a lot about what's going on, but maybe things that have been overlooked by, some of the reporting, and that you wouldn't know just from skimming around online and so forth. And then a little more perhaps substantively on what we are doing, should be doing, could be doing, what more we could be doing, to different things we being the U.S. and maybe Europe and others, to help the Iranian people. So Eric and Ray, thanks for joining.
Thank you. Thanks for having us, Bill.
So I don't know, Ray, whenever I talk to Ray, he always defers to Eric as the senior partner. I think this is just a way of reminding me that he's a little younger than Eric, but that's okay. So Eric, did you want to lead off? I mean, sort of general thoughts for this enlightened group, and what the situations, surprises, one or two things that haven't been noticed, and then Ray.
Well, I'm really the more policy-oriented part of this team as opposed to the Iranist, because Ray really is deeply into this. I mean, look, we're in the, I think, 212th or 213th day of protests, or 113th day of protests. We've got probably somewhere on the order of 750 people who've been killed, 30,000 some detained, protests throughout the country in over 280 cities. What strikes me is that, in contradistinction to earlier rounds of protests, because obviously this is not the first time we've seen protests against the Islamic Republic. I mean, Ray and I, in our 2020 piece, talked about the Green Revolution, talked about even earlier waves of protest in the 80s and 90s. This seems to have become a kind of self-sustaining effort on the part of a very broad swath of Iranian society. And it seems, as we argued in our most recent update to the 2020 piece, that it's reflective of very deep social trends inside Iran, and therefore is not likely to subside anytime soon. And as a consequence, you do see inside the regime now splits developing about how to handle this and how much repression can be applied without causing further cracks in the regime. So from the policy point of view, it seems to me that this is a unique opportunity for the United States. And I'm mindful, as someone who was in government myself, it's very, very hard for any administration to deal with more than one, maybe one and a half big national security issues. And certainly Ukraine is very, very preoccupying, as it should be for the administration. But one, does wonder what, takes to get the administration to actually focus a little bit on Iran, not least because Iran is now contributing to the problems in Ukraine by becoming a major supplier for Russia with the Shahed 136 and other UAVs and loitering munitions that they're providing the Russians. So Ray and I offered some modest suggestions to some things that the administration could do. I would add to what we put.
Let me come back to that, Eric. After getting it, just Ray's take on the situation on the ground in our conversation, you emphasized that you thought it was a revolutionary situation. That was 3 months ago. Genuinely revolutionary situation, and stressed the importance of the things Eric has mentioned, the breadth of the uprising, worker strikes, as well as university students and so forth, beyond the women sort of hijab demands. Not that those are unimportant at all, and may have been crucial, and also the splits in the regime. So, what's your sense, Ray, of just where we are on the ground? And then I'll double back to the question of what the administration should be doing.
Yes, thanks again for having me here today. During the past 3 months, what we have seen is the birth of a national movement, in the sense that it pervades the social classes, it affects all generations, and so the depth and breadth of this dissent has become obvious. As Eric mentioned, previous protests tend to have proximate causes, lack of pay by the teachers, or so forth. This time, they have all come together under the banner of women's freedom, dignity, and so forth. So we do have a national movement in the making. Some strikes have taken place. I think whenever we look at revolutionary situations, which are so unpredictable, we look at previous revolutions as an antecedent. The strikes were very important economically in the 1978-79 revolution because they led to essentially depletion of the regime's treasury. They're less important economically today because the government is already bankrupt, but they're important politically because they isolate the regime. So the way the strikes should be thought about is less on their economic impact and more so on their political indication of the regime's isolation. We see some nascent leadership emerge. I think we mentioned one. The youth of Tehran, the youth of Isfahan, the youth of Qazvin, the youth of this. I don't know much about these organizations, but the reason why they merit mentioning is because when they call for strikes and so forth, that tends to be adhered to. So there is some sort of an organizational network taking place. The challenge for the opposition is to do all these things and more. Every revolutionary situation that you looked at, the one that I'm most familiar with is Iran's 78-79 revolution, will have its ebbs and flows. And so it is important for this galvanizing movement to continue to go forward. The regime's response has actually been interesting, and you have seen some subtle changes in the way they are approaching the situation today. First of all, it has been the position of the regime, a stated position of the regime, that these protests are externally stimulated. They're provocations from abroad. But they're kind of nuancing that a little bit. They're not rejecting the notion that these were externally stimulated, but they're suggesting that those who are protesting are themselves victims of that Western conspiracy. So they have been deluded, and therefore they have to differentiate between those who are hardcore agents of foreign powers and those who are deluded by the sinister and clever Western conspiracy. So that, in a way, is their own carrot and stick approach. On the one hand, they're announcing executions, and I think a number of people have already been executed. On the other hand, their rhetoric toward those who are protesting, including Khamenei's speech yesterday, was a bit more permissive. Hijab is a religious obligation, but if you don't wear your hijab completely, that doesn't mean you're anti-revolutionary. So they're beginning to tailor that a little bit and manage it with some executions as taking place. The regime's conduct in ethnic areas is brutal, and they're using force in those areas. Some portions in northern Iran are already under martial law, but they're not announcing it. I still think they have some concerns about the reliability of their security forces. The reason why the regime's current strategy is unlikely to succeed because it still doesn't address the core problem. The core problem is the Iranian people want extinction of the Islamic Republic. And they don't believe that the regime can be accountable and can address their concerns and grievances. So even the more nuanced approach that they have taken, at least in terms of the rhetorical reception of the protest, is unlikely to succeed. What the regime is trying to do today is not have a galvanizing event, not do something that provokes further instigation of this uprising, not to fuel the uprising further. But it's very hard to do that when you're relying on your repressive organs in order to sustain your power. What we can say today with some measure of confidence, if not complete confidence, is the Islamic Republic only has its military and security services as a source of support. And the question is, how reliable is this conscript army with its multifaceted organizations and so forth? I would say, as a conclusion to this preamble, is every military that faces a civilian uprising has doubts, has defections, and has concerns. Now, those doubts, defections, and concerns may not be sufficient to prevent it from discharging its obligations. The Chinese and Tiananmen Square in 1989 did so, despite the fact that there were a number of defections and so forth. So the question is, as this protest movement prolongs, can the regime maintain the cohesion of its security services, given all the reasonable doubts and that percolate in any security service which is asked to kill its citizens? And obviously, one of the more unique aspects of this is the participation and leadership of women. That makes its repression more difficult. If you think about, I think Eric was Ukraine in 2014 when they brought women into the protest movement and essentially strategically placed them in order to deter the security forces from repression, and it worked. So the fact that this is a female-led protest, or certainly has a significant female-led leadership in terms of composition of the protest, it makes this repression even more difficult. So we're in this revolutionary situation with all this ebbs and flows. Both sides are in a position where I don't think there can be a bridging compact. There cannot be a new national compact that will essentially reinvigorate the Islamic Republic.
Yeah, very interesting. Just one more point on what's happening there before we get to here, as it were. Well, just 3 points, but maybe the first two don't even need to be addressed. Splits in the leadership that are notable.
Yeah. Yes.
Secondly, leadership of the opposition. There seems to be some greater coordination among them. Is that adequate for now? I mean, not that we can do much about it, frankly, and it's easy to sit here and say, "Oh, I wish they were more, more unified." They're pretty impressive, but is that an issue? And third, this is particularly for Ray, maybe, but are there things we should look for? Revolutions are hugely unpredictable, but are there dates? Are there moments? Are there inflection points that one can sort of see? Known unknowns as opposed to unknown unknowns ahead. So Ray, why don't you just pick up there quickly on those, and then Eric, and then we'll get to the
splits in the political elite are obvious. There's a commentary by the editor of the Jumhuriyet Islami, which is Khamenei's paper, rejecting the argument and saying, look, we cannot say these are internally instigated and not really deal with the deep causes of revolution. The regime has a problem with the clerical community, the Shrine City of Qom and the leading clerics. They have not been able to get a statement of support from them. They have gotten statements of criticism. And one of the regime's parliamentarians actually in today's papers criticized the Majaz, the leadership of the clergy, saying, okay, what is your solution to the problem? All you do is offer criticism. It is important I want to say that people suggest the security services in the Islamic Republic are imbued with a certain ideological fervor. I don't know if that's true or not, but the regime doesn't own this ideology. The ideology can be contested from the shrine cities, from other clerical elements. So, as Trotsky would say, there's dual sovereignty here. So the regime has a problem because even if its foot soldiers are ideologically motivated, that ideology is not its ownership. They don't have complete control over it. The head of the Jumhuriyet Islami newspaper who criticized him is a cleric. You cannot be anything but a cleric to be head of the Jumhuriyet Islami. So they're getting clerical opposition. There is indications of divisions within the regime itself, not just within the political elite. You had a couple of weeks ago, Mr. Montaseri saying, we're going to get rid of the hijab. We're going to study it in 15 days. In 15 days, they came out and saying it's still important. So the internal cohesion of the system is not obvious. It is suggested that the head of their national security, Shamkhani, and the President Raisi are at odds because of this thing. And you can understand that, right? Anytime an uprising like this happens, people within the regime begin to blame each other. So far, I think Ali Khamenei is a glue that holds the regime together. And those fissures are unlikely to kind of cause the regime to implode internally. But I think outside there's considerable degree of dissent about what is happening. But even those who are offering their dissent, they tend to focus on how do we get the population re-engaged with the Islamic Republic, as we did in the early periods of the revolution. We address their economic concerns, and as a matter of fact, one of them said, unlike China and Russia, we don't have support of our own people.
Interesting. And what about any dates, any moments coming up that are worth particularly looking at? And then I'll go to Eric.
Bill, I would never say that September 22nd was a day 16th that they look at, and it became a date. I mean, it becomes a date in the aftermath of the date.
Fair enough.
So I'm not sure if there's anything.
Okay. I just thought maybe, that's helpful. Eric, any little footnotes to that, but maybe we'll just pivot to what you're so familiar with, which is, as you said, what can or should the U.S. or friendly other free administrations of free governments, free nations be doing, and how much? Well, how are we doing a little more than what should we be doing?
So we made a few modest suggestions, as I said in our foreign affairs update a couple of days ago. One of which is to take the benefit of a political reality, which is that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is dead. It couldn't possibly survive in the U.S. Congress in the current environment, and so the effort, President Biden himself has admitted, privately, that it's dead, and that but he doesn't want to talk about it. We think you can make a virtue of the reality by acknowledging that it's dead, because that, among other things, will send a very clear signal to the Iranian population that there is no prospect of getting out from under the sanctions as long as this regime is in place. And I think that would be a very powerful message. Be also a message, by the way, to our allies. And I don't think it's an accident, as I might have said, Comrade, in my previous life. Iranians now are making a lot of noise to the Europeans about they really do want to get back into the JCPOA, despite the fact that they have levied requirements on the Biden administration that have made it impossible. Namely, basically refusing to clear up concerns that the IAEA has about past activities, why the Iranians have all these particles of enriched uranium on their equipment that they can't explain, as well as demanding that the Biden administration guarantee for all time into the future that any future administration will not, as the Trump administration, pull out a deal, something which the Biden administration obviously can't deliver. Second, I think if you get out from under the JCPOA, also allows the administration to actually go back to fully enforcing the sanctions. Biden administration has not been doing that, in part because it wanted to try and ease the path back into the agreement. But I think, forcing the sanctions that are on the books and then looking at what more can be done is an important part of this. I know tomorrow you're going to have Stuart Levy on, who is the leading expert on all this and did a fantastic job, both in the Bush 43 and in the first couple of years of the Obama administration in masterminding a lot of the sanctions effort against Iran. And I'm sure Stuart can suggest even more specific things that could be done, down the road. And then third, to your point, Bill, about leadership and the emergence of leadership, I think there's much more that can be done to facilitate allowing Iranians to communicate with one another. Look, this is of a piece with things that we did during the Cold War, like helping Solidarity by, in those days, providing them with typewriters and things like that. We're obviously in a different information age, but there are lots of things that could be done. Repurposing certain kinds of apps for social media that have been used, for instance, to verify elections in sub-Saharan Africa. Those could be repurposed and used to allow Iranian dissidents to communicate with one another about protests that are going on, coordinating protests, overstretching the regime's security services by making them respond in multiple places at the same time. There's a lot that could be done there. And then I would add one thing that we didn't have in the article, but I do think is really important for the President of the United States, not just to make occasional statements to the press on the tarmac about this, but actually devoting a kind of address. It doesn't necessarily need to be an Oval Office address, but a speech somewhere fully devoted to the importance of this issue and why Americans sympathize with those who are protesting the regime and want to see them succeed, and why success is so important, particularly since I don't think the administration can go on forever with its current posture, which is that the JCPOA is dead, but we're not going to acknowledge that, but not saying what the plan B is to prevent Iran from moving forward on the nuclear issue, where it is in fact in breach of most of the limitations of the JCPOA in terms of levels of enrichment, how much low enriched uranium they have, et cetera, and are creeping closer and closer to not just a breakout or a sneak out, but just being a latent nuclear power.
That's interesting. I mean, I suppose one thing this is way short of a full speech or a full policy paper or full policy, but there will be a State of the Union address. I don't know if it's scheduled yet, but it's almost always very end of January, probably very early February.
That's if the House can organize itself.
Yeah, if the House, yes, I guess it has to be delivered to an actual functioning House of Representatives, or at least that's been the custom. That would, one could overdo the endless, what does he say in the one paragraph about this or that? You and I, we've all been in government, and many of us have been involved in these fights. Can we get one sentence in on this? But I would say Ukraine, I think, is pretty straightforward. I mean, I think we know what he'll say. And I think most people, well, I won't speak for anyone else. I'll probably, pretty content with it, reasonably at least. Iran is more of a question mark, right? He hasn't really addressed it formally that much. And I think the content of that paragraph or two or three, and whether it is incidentally one paragraph or four paragraphs, makes some difference, don't you think? That's sort of something I think domestically, people who are in touch with people in the administration or on the Hill who can have some input to that, probably a little bit of a chance to make some difference. Do you think, Eric?
I think it makes a difference both to frame the issue here domestically. I think it makes a difference in terms of how allies will see the issue. I think in some sense it's a natural for the administration because it falls into the framing that the president has periodically given to his foreign policy of democracy, the success of democracy as opposed to the authoritarian regimes. The fact that Iran, as I said, is now one of the main military suppliers to Russia, violation of UN Security Council resolution, by the way. Again, I think makes this a very natural topic for the president to address and to frame up.
Interesting. Ray, a couple of additional thoughts, and we'll go to Jeff and Jeff will handle the questions.
Sure. I would say, Bill, you said, what should we look forward to in dates? And the Iranians are going to confront us with a nuclear crisis. They're going to dramatically upgrade their nuclear facilities and expand their nuclear facilities and infrastructure, and in terms of advancement of their program, while at the same time offering negotiations. They're going to do that. They're doing that already. And that's going to create its own momentum toward diplomacy, perhaps. The purpose of the Iranians seeking to come back to the negotiations, I would say, is not to address the concerns that Eric suggested, is to demoralize the domestic opposition. So what we can look forward to is how do we deal with a nuclear crisis, and
Interesting.
what happens there. And I think this solidarity that we see today may begin to fracture in terms of in the West, among the American public today, and with the administration and its critics and what have you. Now, the question is, what is to be done? In order to answer that question, you have to ask yourself, what is the source of regime's strength? And it's the security forces. Then you ask yourself, what it is we can do to attenuate that particular source of strength. How is it that a foreign power, and I put it all to, this is a very illustrious group of people with a lot of experience. What can we do to weaken the last pillar of the Iranian regime? If anything, why is it in a country simmering with dissent, we haven't seen high profile defections? The Iranian soccer team was holding press conference saying the situation in our homeland is not good. Why is it none of one of those people end up in a press conference in Vienna? How many Soviet and Eastern European athletes defect? Having provoking defections in the security services demoralizes the security services because it engenders suspicions within them about who's in, who's out, who's on this. Finally, I would say that economic pressure is important. Now, I understand that poverty does not cause revolutions, injustice does, but poverty is a most glaring manifestation of the regime's inadequacy that unites the social classes. Because in any authoritarian regime that is experiencing economic distress, there's going to be inequalities. Some people will continue to live well, and some people won't. Corruption will be even more endemic. So all the pathologies of the regime will become more accentuated when it's under economic stress. And that is a powerful force for unification and continued galvanization of the opposition. But that's what I would say.
Very interesting. I would just say maybe, Jeff, I'll let you run the kind of Q&A and comments, but people, I think, should feel free briefly to make comments, not just ask questions, because I take Ray is not just being polite when he says there are a lot of people on this call who might have ideas or modifications of what's been said or additions to what's been said in terms of actual suggestions.
So, Bill, thank you. And Eric and Ray, thank you very much. Eric, you mentioned it, so I'll mention it again, that tomorrow at 12 noon Eastern, we have Stuart Levy on sanctions, and he really does bring deep knowledge to the subject area and in relationship to Iran. Shah will put that link in chat. If you can join, please do so. I'm going to take the liberty of asking a first question as you all put your questions in chat or use the raised hand function, coming to you in just a moment. Bill, you're a co-panelist now. So to you three or whoever wants to take it. When I talk to Europeans, it's a bit of a side issue, but I don't think it's unrelated. We're trying to build a coalition, support people of Iran, and weaken the regime. And as you say, Ray, hasten the demise of this one last strong and central pillar. One thing that one hears these days from Europeans, and I do mean like-minded Europeans, I don't mean status quo, regime sympathetic Europeans, is what does this look like in transition? What happens if the regime collapses? Do regime elements go underground, guns and money? Are there vacuums exploited by terrorist groups? Now, I repeat the question that's posed to me by European friends. I'm certainly of the view that uncertainty about the future cannot be an excuse for inaction now. But nevertheless, there are people concerned about those kinds of questions and a little bit spooked by the experience of Iraq. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Eric, do you want to start? Or
Look, there are no guarantees in this business. I mean, we don't know what lies on the other side. I mean, look, people who I take seriously, like our friend Kareem Sajidpour, has told Ray and me he thinks we're right, that regime change is going to have to come, but he also says he thinks what's coming is probably going to be worse than the current regime in some ways. And look, from the point of view of deterring Iran or delaying Iran from pursuing a nuclear weapon, turmoil And, uncertainty actually could be a good thing, because they'll have, if there's a struggle, a Hobbesian struggle for survival inside the country, people will, be focused on that rather on some of the other things that have been problematic for us, not just the nuclear, but the chronic meddling in the neighborhood, et cetera, things that have been a problem for our allies. So, my view is a little bit the Napoleonic one, on s'engage et puis au revoir. We have to go forward, and then we'll have to make adjustments along the way, as you always do. But I would think that both because of Iran's role now in Ukraine, but also because this pattern of Iranian involvement in assassinations or plotting on the territory of other countries, not just the United States, where we still have several former officials of the Trump administration traveling around with protective details, but also in European countries, governments of our allies will realize that, in the end of the day, there's really not much of an alternative policy to be had here.
I would just say, if I can, a couple of things. Iran today has the antecedents of a possible democratic success. It has number of, number one, it has 95% literacy, a population that may be middle class and beleaguered middle class. There's a term called middle class poor, in the sense they're middle class in aspiration, but poor in their financial profile. But also, Iran, unlike Syria and unlike some of its neighbors, has had a long experience with mass political participation for purpose of democratic system throughout the 20th century and into 21st century. So it is a population that has always sought a government that is accountable, and it has always faced governments that have not been accountable. And one of the, I believe, and again, this is a very illustrious group of people. One of the definitions of post-revolutionary success is the experience of the population with political participation at a fairly mass level. And you have seen that in Iran without stoppage. And also one of the predictors, elements of what the post-revolutionary situation looks like is how the revolution succeeds. Is it succeed as a mass movement that in some kind of a negotiated compact with the regime, then that outcome is different than a sort of a degeneration into a civil war. I tend to be optimistic about the post-Islamic Republic Iran, but without being Pollyannish. I would say that I may be alone. I'm not traumatized by the Iraq experience, because I think they're two different countries, and the means of their emancipation will obviously be very different. So I tend to be optimistic about the future because of all the aspects of Iran's history. Eric is my most illustrious co-author. Ruel Gurek is not. But Ruel Gurek and I recently wrote a piece. I never use the word I, but because I had a high school coach who said there's no I in team, and that has really been built into me. But I would say we actually compare this with Arab Spring and why there's a possibility of success here in a piece we did for the journal. I'm optimistic about the success. As far as the notion that the successor regime is worse, honestly, I don't know how that's possible. An anti-Semitic, anti-American regime that explains its predicament through the prism of conspiracy theories and is arming itself with nuclear arms. Somebody tell me what worse looks like.
Jeff, could I
So,
just
but- Yeah, please.
add one word? Because I know in the chat someone's raised the question of, what lessons can be learned from the failure of the Iraqi National Congress, the INC, to be a viable post, Saddam government in Iraq. And Ray just has adverted to this, which is that civil society in Iran seems much more robust than the case in Iraq. I remember colleagues telling me before March 2003, since we're about to hit the 20th anniversary of the beginning of the war in Iraq, that, INC was, compromised because they were all exiles, and whatever political leadership post-Saddam that would arise in Iraq would arise from within. Well, 20 years on, almost all the senior politicians in Iraq were people who were in exile during Saddam's era, because he had so atomized Iraqi society that there really was no ability for anybody to emerge. I mean, the only real political leader who emerged out of the wreckage was really Muqtada al-Sadr, which wasn't quite, I think, what my State Department colleagues had in mind when they said, leadership was going to emerge from within. So I think that there is, as Ray said, some prospect here, something emerging that is, not quite the messy kind of result we saw when regime change was imposed by force of arms. I mean, I think one of the things that is important distinction here is Ray and I are not talking about, sending the 82nd Airborne and the 101st and, forcibly imposing regime change on Iran. We're talking about aiding the people of Iran, to do what Iranians have done multiple times in their history, which is to rise up and demand political change and a change of regime.
Can I just say one thing? I'll be very brief. A part of the success of post-revolutionary government, if it comes about, is how the international community behaves. Part of the reason for the failure of Iraq was because so many actors like Iran were determined to fuel the civil war and deepen the sectarian divide and further divide that society. So the international community will have a role. Every time we ask one of these questions, how do we weaken the military? How do we make sure this succeeds? Every time we make statement, this can't succeed. Turn those statements into questions and then decide how we can improve that situation.
So thank you both. Bill, did you want to get in on this?
Nope. Nothing to add.
Okay, not yet. So listen, several of you have questions or comments in chat. Eric just addressed one. Unless I see your hand waving at me or the raised hand function, I'll let it be worked out in chat. But Shay, I know your hand is up and you have the floor.
Yeah, just on the last point that was mentioned, and for those who don't know, if you cannot tell from my accent, I'm named, I grew up in Iran. On the Iraqi experience, well, I always go back to the Iran is, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is probably the oldest nation state in history that is still running, and that shows itself. And these are just anecdotal evidence from growing up there, but we've seen a lot about how Iran is maybe even at this point majority, but also go back to soccer, which is quite an important element of the Iranian society. It's actually very important to Iranians. And one of the few things that the regime has not completely succeeded in confiscating, the national team remains probably the only source of patriotism / nationalism in Iran. And what I remember is many of my friends who are minorities in Iran and quite explicit about their ethnic status, how they would jump up and down for the national team. And I came to this realization after I lived in Europe and saw after 2010 World Cup that Spain won, in contrast with Catalans, whom I would meet, and I'm a Spanish soccer fan, and I would say, oh, great, like Spanish team just won the World Cup and they couldn't care less. And that was the realization for me about that sense of ethnic attachment to Iran or being Iranian. That is quite different for many other minorities who live in other countries. I just thought that to mention that.
Shay, thank you.
If there's a chance to speak, I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand. Sorry, because
Miriam,
I'm
I
mobile.
hear you, and you have the microphone.
Thank you so much. A lot of respect to the authors of this piece and all the work that they've done in the past as well. I want to echo something that Ray mentioned at the end. I think it's a point about preparedness from the international community. Everything is going to be in the hands of what world powers decide to do. And I take Eric's point that we can't control everything. But I think the more important point is what Ray is saying, that it's hard to imagine a worse type of regime. And we're not going to get an opportunity like this every day. It's not necessarily the case that this revolutionary moment is going to just continue to gain momentum. It might die down. We might lose another 5 years. And then what happens in the meanwhile with the nuclear program and other things? We started an initiative called Cyrus Forum, focused on getting that preparedness going from Iranians about the day after regime collapse or overthrow. But it's equally important that the international community see that day and begin to not just talk about it, but prepare for it. What are the things that are necessary to have? And I think one of the ways that the international community doesn't lose anything is to engage with dissidents as diverse a set of dissidents as possible, starting now, and showing the regime that, yes, you want to come back to the negotiating table now, maybe because you're in a lot of trouble at home, but we do have other people to talk to. And even if it ends up that the revolution doesn't succeed, the international community, the United States, Europeans, Canada, they don't lose anything by showing themselves to be close to the democratic sentiments of the Iranian people, because that's more leverage to use on any other issue. I just wanted to add that.
Miriam, thank you. Michelle, would you, if you haven't done so already, could you put a link in chat to Miriam's group, Cyrus Forum? It's important and worth looking at if you've not yet seen it. Eric, Ray, Bill, any comment to what Miriam said, or you want to let that stand? Bill?
No, Ray, you'd have the most maybe on that.
No, I tend to agree with what Miriam said. I do believe that there's a role for the international community in at this point in the aftermath, and we need to start thinking about that as an important contingency. As far as this movement dying out, I think the sources of grievances are so profound and pronounced that it is not going to die down. The future of the Islamic Republic will be one of two things: either chronic instability as the regime continues to battle various elements of the opposition that pop up at various times, or the implosion of the regime. I don't believe there will be a new national compact revitalizing the Islamic Republic. And one of the things that Ali Khamenei is really the glue that holds the system together today. And I don't think the regime is ready for a succession crisis in midst of this particular situation. When Stalin died, Dwight Eisenhower got very angry. He said, "We've been talking about Stalin dying for some time. Now that he's dead, tell me what the government has done." And it hadn't done it. And that was a government that included Chip Bolan and George Kennett. So, but we need to start kind of thinking about what happens in the aftermath of 83-year-old Khamenei dying in the middle of this particular crisis. Because I think he's the one that holds the regime together. In absence of him, I think you see different people in the regime side against each other, plot against each other, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of grievances within the system as they're asked to engage in this system of repression. More importantly, why is the intelligence services of Iran failed to see this coming? We always talk about intelligence failure. Boy, they put the word failure and intelligence failure on this one.
Can I just add one word now that I'm just thinking as Ray was speaking? Yeah, I think we do underestimate a little bit. I mean, because we all look at different countries and different times, the importance of international support or meddling conversely, obviously in the Iraq case, I think there were real, who knows, it could have gone, we made most of the mistakes that probably, caused it not to go well. But there was real meddling by Iran and lack of support by others. And we didn't pressure other Arab nations to do as much as we could have and so forth. The Arab Spring, I mean, I defer to people on the call who know much more than I do, but it's not clear to me that it needed to have gone in the way it did, which was not ultimately very productive, you might say. But we had an administration, frankly, that was bipartisan, to be fair, that didn't want to do much there. Syria didn't have to be the way it was, I don't think, if we had acted differently in 2013. So people are, without even military intervention, the degree to which I very much agree with Maria's notion that it's not all on the Iranians to make this work. It's like, well, you guys have a big, long nation, as Shay said, and long history, and you have sort of a middle class, and good luck, guys. That's not been our attitude to other revolution. Ours doesn't work in 1776 without help from the international, it's 83 without help from the international community. We should be a little less contemptuous. They really deserve our help, not just now, but going forward.
And
Moderator.
and just about to, excuse me, and the Syrian case, the intervention of external powers called Russia and China, Russia and Iran, actually materially influenced the direction of that revolution, Bill. The Russian intervention was critical in success of the Assad regime, as was the Iranians.
Yeah. If I could just add, look, I very much agree with Miriam's point that, this might not come around again, which is one of the reasons I think Ray and I felt so strongly about doing a follow-up piece to our 2020 piece. These kinds of situations don't just materialize out of thin air, and we need to take advantage of it. And I very much agree with her point about associating ourselves with the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people. I mean, Iran was one country in the region which on 9/11 had spontaneous pro-American demonstrations breaking out, because there is a lot of sympathy in the public for the United States as opposed to the regime. And there's a risk, if we don't step forward, of squandering that. I mean, in 2009, when the Obama administration chose to be silent, which I think is something that a lot of people in the current administration who served in the Obama administration have a case of bad conscience about and are, hopeful of doing more. But so far they haven't stepped up to the plate as far as I'm concerned.
Moderator Gordon Humphrey here. May I speak?
Please, Gordon, let's hear from, we have 10 minutes left. Let's hear from Gordon and Alexander and Larry Diamond. If you want to speak to the question you put in chat, you'll be welcome to. And Gordon, you have the floor.
Thanks. I'll try to be very brief because you have some distinguished people on your list. The question for the House is, what can we do to help the Iranian revolutionaries? Power is generally summarized by the acronym DIME, D-I-M-E. Diplomatic, we're doing diplomatic things. Information, I'll pass on that for the moment. Military is not applicable in this case. And economic, obviously, we're applying the sanctions. So back to information. Freedom House shows that in the last 25 years, fewer and fewer people have lived in free regimes. In fact, it's now fewer than 20% of people worldwide. Obviously, that applies to Iran, Russia, North Korea, China, and many more. So where is the information? Where is the information war, shall we say, initiative was so instrumental in helping to bring the Cold War to a positive end? Where is it? It's missing. Uncle Sam has lost his voice. There's no commitment from the president, no commitment in the State Department. The Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy has been vacant since 2018 through two regimes. I'll leave it there. I could say a great deal more, but Uncle Sam is dumb. Is he also stupid? I don't think so. We need leadership, starting with the president and the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State and distinguished persons such as you. Thank you.
So, Gordon, Senator Humphrey, thank you very much. Anybody want to take that?
No, I very much agree with Senator Humphrey that, we have, I think, chronically deficient over the last 20 years. And it's not just, in this instance, it was true, I think, in the period when we were engaged in what people used to call the war on terror. We've been very, very bad on the public diplomacy front. it's more than public diplomacy, really, because it goes across a full spectrum of activities, as Senator Humphrey suggests, in the information domain. It's what George Kennan, because I know there's been some conversation about George Kennan in the chat, described in 1948 as political warfare. And it's basically the use of all instruments of national power outside of the military to try and affect the political ends of the nation's strategy. And, since and I'm somewhat guilty here because I was chief of staff to the Deputy Secretary of State when this happened, since we disassembled the USIA, we, in the late 1990s, we've just been really bad at this and have not put in much effort. And I mentioned to Senator Humphrey offline that on more than one occasion when I worked for Bob Gates, he complained about how was it that the country that invented advertising was being beaten to the punch in public information by, the Taliban sitting in caves with laptops. And so I do think it's something that, it's a broader issue than just Iran. It needs to be addressed. It's also important, I think, in the Russia-Ukraine context as well, and potentially in the China context also, keeping in mind the protests that broke out in late November and early December in China over COVID policy, which is, I think the Washington Post reported today, that those who generated the protest are now being, systematically hunted down by the regime. So this is something I think that's a global challenge for us.
So I'm going to take the liberty of addressing one piece of that, and then I'm going to call on Alexander and Larry Diamond, and then we'll probably have, we will have an opportunity for you three to comment before we close out. So I will say, as the former president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and a board member currently of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, for one piece, there is a Persian service. There's a network of report. This is not public diplomacy, by the way. And to what Eric said stands, and we're really bad at this, and we need something broader, integrated, aligned, robust. We do that. But the Persian service of RFERL has a network of reporters working clandestinely inside the country. There's a network of stringers around the country in Yerevan, Dubai, Istanbul, Baku, where there are significant expat communities or Iranians coming in and out, students and business people. And there are 40 Iranians in Prague at the headquarters, from producers to technicians to editors to online video reporters. And they are doing reporting. Now, it's not in English language. And principally what they're endeavoring to do is to offer reliable, accurate, fast, fact-based journalism for the people of Iran. So if there's a bus strike somewhere, people want to know, and not just from social media and from citizen journalism, but more, I would say, accurately, who organized the strike, who's striking, who's been detained, who's being punished, what's the condition of the families, and so on and so forth. So that is but one piece. Eric's comments stand, but I wanted to make that comment and observation to you. Alexander, and then Larry, and then final from Ray, Eric, and Bill. Alexander, you have the floor.
Thank you. My question is for today's two guests, and it is, if you were advisors to Khamenei or to Raisi, what strategy would you recommend to help the survival of the regime?
I would advise them to defect and live in exile in Belarus or Shanghai or something like that. And more seriously, I think the regime as I mentioned, is a dilemma. It is trying not to offer further provocations to the opposition, while at the same time gaining control of the situation. That is almost impossible for them to square. What I would recommend them to do is have a very robust international effort and try to re-engage the international community on nuclear issue, and hope that will somehow contribute to demoralization of the opposition. Maybe even make concessions on the nuclear front in order to regenerate the economic levers. So I think they cannot, in my judgment, rely on internal constituencies to revitalize the regime. So they should look to external ones.
Yeah, I mean, I largely would agree with Ray. I mean, I think if I were in their shoes, I would stop demanding that the Biden administration guarantee things it can't guarantee. I would try and come up with some face-saving arrangement with Rafael Grossi of the IAEA about unexplained issues with their nuclear program, and hope that they could get back into the JCPOA for the last 2 years of the Biden administration, get out from under sanctions, and then use that to propitiate at least a part of the public that can be bought off with purely material, means. I think that's very hard, actually, because I think particularly on making a clean breast with the IAEA, I think it would reveal too much about their earlier violations and programs, and makes it very hard. I think that makes it very hard for them to do.
Okay. Eric, thank you. Larry Diamond, if you're still with us, you have penultimate word if you want it. Larry?
Well, it's not so much a word as a question, which, to briefly restate what I put in the chat, is, what can be done on the outside among the Iranian exile community to try to strategize and think through what a post collapse of the Islamic Republic looks like. What we know a lot about the necessary requirements for a successful transition from any kind of authoritarian regime to the kind of Iran we want to see after, which is a democratic Iran. There would need to be a period of transitional rule. There needs to be some strategy for dealing with the old order. There needs to be some constitutional, vision for the future of Iran, which people have taken a crack at thinking about in the past. There needs to be thinking about what the constituent elements of a new political order might be. And the danger, of course, which we learned in Iraq, is that you get exiled personalities who put themselves forward as available leaders of the new order who don't have any constituency, and then that's not helpful. But thinking could be helpful, and then disseminating the thinking in Iran and the options, I think, could be helpful. And the successful lessons of revolutionary types of democratic movements from elsewhere in the world, and maybe the stimulation of dialogue between inside and outside. Maybe Ray can say more about what's going on in that regard. Anyway, it's been a fantastic discussion, and I hope it can continue.
Larry, thank you. We are over time, but it's important. And Eric and Ray, please weigh in. And Bill, we're going to give you the final word or observations. Eric?
Well, I mean, it sounds to me like Larry was describing the future of Iran project. I'm not sure. I'm not sure where we should house it, but it sounds like certainly a good, a worthwhile endeavor. And I think even, wherever, whether it was done in some kind of international grouping or in, somehow in the U.S. or what have you, I think even the fact of the administration announcing that it was participating in something like this, or, funding something like this would already send, an interesting and important signal to the folks inside, and might actually help precipitate some of that internal, external dialogue that Larry correctly, I think, identified as being very, very important. There will have to be some kind of reckoning post regime with what this regime has done to the Iranian people over the last 40 years, and how that takes place will be very, very important.
I'll just say a few things as we wrap up. I think the exile community has managed to put aside as many differences, at least for now, and have some sort of a cohesive voice in support of the regime. I have always believed, and I continue to believe, that the Iranians within Iran are the drivers of their history, and they're the architects of their destiny. And the level of debate and discussion that is taking place in Iran itself is extraordinarily sophisticated and extraordinarily important. One of the things that I think, as this opposition should mature and develop a more cohesive leadership, has to do is talk to the existing elements within the regime, as the 1979 revolutionaries did. They should really start talking about not so much as avenging the past, but looking to the future of Iran. They should talk about Truth and Reconciliation Committee. You talk about the truth, we offer you reconciliation. And that is going to be hard. But I think that's indispensable to success. I don't think, God willing, if we get to the post-revolutionary Iran, they should try to avenge the past. It's not easy, but I think if the opposition and the external actors and everybody else starts talking about the fact that there is room for those within Iran today who don't wish to be part of the repressive regime, there's a future for you in the aftermath of the life. And by the way, that is one of the most sophisticating things that 1978-79 revolutionaries did with their outreach to the security services. It was a promise that was not met, but it was offered in an opportune time, because there's going to be a lot of people who are hedging here. Ali Larijani is hedging. So that has to be one of the focus of everybody. And I will say one thing last. I know I said the last time, several last times, but this really is the last time. We talk about President Biden giving a speech and others. Everybody has a moral obligation to speak today. The newspapers, magazines, civil society activists, Eric Edelman and I, we all have an obligation, not just the official podiums.
So thank you. Bill, wrap us up.
No, this has been an excellent discussion. I really don't have anything to add. I one of the best I've been involved in many, I've been in many over many years, and this has really been very helpful and thought-provoking and sort of inspiring, really, and lots of stuff to follow up on. So maybe, Jeff, we should do this again and get the same people back, and I don't know when, a month. As revolutionary situations can be pretty fast changing, as Ray pointed out, however, and I think we put this together pretty quickly, didn't we, after Ray and Eric's piece came out. So maybe we can do this again when it's worth doing.
By all means, Bill, Eric, Ray, everybody, thank you very much.